As the airborne general languished in his attic, the guards began to push on at speed. With the Grenadiers in the lead, they covered 20 miles in just a few hours to link up with the American 82nd Division, which had captured the bridge at Grave on the first day.
Well, my name is Moffatt Burriss, and I'm from Columbia, South Carolina. And I was company commander of I Company, 504 Parachute Regiment, 82nd Airborne Division. The operation just went right. It went as planned. As soon as we got within rifle and machine gun range of the bridge and fired, they started waving a white flag. I think it was one of them's undershirt, and they surrendered. And at that point, we felt real good, and we said, maybe we will be home by Christmas.
The British sped across the bridge towards Grosbeek, which dominated the town of Nijmegen. There were now just 2 bridges left between them and the German heartland. There was a good chance that Market Garden would work. The Guards' tanks were here. Horrocks was on his way up the column, and the Americans were already fighting in the streets of Nijmegen. To succeed, the British and Americans had to capture the bridge there, the last before the bridge at Arnhem, just 8 miles away. On the 4th day of the operation, General Horrocks arrived to join his tanks in Nijmegen. He made straight for the best viewpoint in town, the power station by the river. Today, it has been replaced by a new one, but the view is still substantially the same. This is what Horrocks would have seen. In front of him was a huge river, the Waal. To his east, the ancient city of Nijmegen, with its 2 bridges. The nearer one carries the railway. The further one, at that stage amongst the largest in Europe, the road. The town was already wreathed in smoke from the street fighting which was taking place. But he could see more smoke, away to the north. He could see smoke from the fighting at Arnhem. Frost and his men had held the bridge for 3 days now, without reinforcement. But the tanks of the SS Panzer divisions were beginning to blast them out.
The tactic was to fire high explosive into the sides of the building to break the wall down, then fire smoke shells through that. And of course the smoke shells have got phosphorus in them. The phosphorus sets light to anything inflammable in the house, and they then burned the perimeter down bit by bit over the period of the next 48 hours. Once the water ran out and the flames became uncontrollable, then you had to get out of the building as quickly as you could and get into another one and set that up for defense.
Just a few miles away in Nijmegen, Horrocks' soldiers had had no success in crossing the bridge. They were still fighting in the streets of the town. It was time to try another approach. Horrocks held a conference here at the power station. The plan was to cross the river in force in boats. To do so in daylight was a fearsome undertaking. The Germans were securely ensconced behind a dike on the far bank of the river, making the attack doubly dangerous. But if the Allies were to reach Arnhem in time, risks had to be taken. Having been ordered up from Grave the previous night, Moffatt Burriss was at the conference.
And when we got to the top floor, already there was Colonel Tucker, our regimental commander, and General Browning, and General Horrocks. And General Horrocks asked Colonel Tucker, "Is this an awesome task? Can your lads do it, Colonel Tucker?" And Colonel Tucker's response was, "Well, General, if we take the bridge, will your troops be lined up ready? Will your tanks be lined up ready to go? And I can remember his words as if he said them yesterday. He said, my tanks will be lined up in full force, hell-bent for Arnhem, and nothing will stop them.
Horrocks' confidence seemed boundless. Those tanks would come from the Grenadier Guards, who were now in the middle of a bitter battle in Nijmegen, fighting through houses and streets, and finally through a wooded park which overlooked the bridge. It was very slow and difficult fighting.
At 2 o'clock that afternoon, the guns of 30 Corps opened fire on the German positions across the river.
We were really horrified that we would be crossing that swift river in those canvas paddle boats. Because with only 3, 4, 5, or 6 paddles in there, the men had to paddle with their rifle butts.
While the crossing was in progress, Horrocks and Browning were watching from the top of the power station, almost like monarchs looking out over some 18th century battlefield, unable to influence things and well aware that triumph or disaster hinged on the sheer courage of the men down here.
Well, when we got the lead boat got about a third of the way across, all hell broke loose. That's when the rifle fire, the machine gun fire, 20mm fire, just open fire. Men started slumping in the boat, some of them killed, some of them wounded. I remember in my boat, I was sitting on the back seat with the engineer, and he was standing there with the boat paddle acting as a rudder. And he had one hand was on the side of the boat, and I noticed his wrist turn red, and he said, "Captain, take the rudder, I've been hit." Well, just as I reached for the rudder, he caught a 20mm high explosive right through his head, and it just blew his head apart, just blew it off. And I was just covered with my head and shoulders and side with his blood and brains, and I caught some of the shrapnel in my side. When we hit the opposite bank, I said, "All right, let's go head straight for the dike." Well, as we started across that pasture, those machine guns just had a complete field of fire that it was just running through a hail of bullets. Nobody stopped unless they were hit.
The Val crossing was one of the bravest attacks of the entire campaign. Crossing the river and taking this dike cost Burriss about half his company. But the survivors then had to go on and take those bridges to help the tanks to get across.
When they reached the road leading to the bridge, the Americans achieved complete surprise. But then they heard the sound of tanks. They thought the tanks were German. But they weren't. They were the tanks of the Grenadiers, led by a sergeant from Lord Carrington's squadron.
He and his tanks, 3 tanks, whatever they were, went over, and I followed him over. I thought they were going to blow the bridge up at any moment, and I imagine so did he. And I was absolutely astonished when we got over the bridge.
We just swarmed over the tank and started hugging the guys. I remember the guy's head that was sticking out of the turret. I just hugged him around the neck, and I said, "You guys are the greatest sight I've seen in years." And I kissed the tank and told them to head on to Arnhem.
But the tanks didn't move. Ahead of them on the road was a German anti-tank gun.
So I went over and I said, "Why are you stopping? Why are you not going to Arnhem?" He said, "Well, I can't go up there. That gun will knock out my tank." And I said, well, we'll go with you and get that gun. And he said, no, I can't go without orders.
The guards had fought their way onto the bridge through tough resistance, and they were worried about the ground on the other side of the bridge.
The road from the bridge was on a sort of embankment, and I think it would have been quite difficult to go ahead. I think it would have been difficult anyway, even in the daylight, because you were a sitting duck if anybody was there. But I thought at night, when we'd just sort of stormed the bridge, so to speak, it would have been very difficult to push through in the dark.
Well, I felt betrayed. I just sacrificed half of my company to capture that bridge, and in the face of dozens of guns, and they were stopping because of one gun, and they had a whole corps of tanks.
The tanks didn't move that night. The Grenadiers' war diary speaks of the need to consolidate the captured bridge. But it's clear that Horrocks' sense of high tempo hadn't percolated down the chain of command. Although the Grenadiers weren't to know it, there was almost nothing between them and Arnhem, 8 miles away. And the plan might yet have worked, because in Arnhem, Frost's men still retained their handhold on the north end of the bridge.
We had, by this time, about 300 wounded in the cellars, but I still believed that 30 Corps would be coming up, certainly up to the south bank, within a matter of almost hours. And we could hear them. I think Lord Carrington was across the bridge before we were overrun. A very close run thing.